What's going on, guys? Welcome to Plant Lecture 2. In this video we're going to finish out our discussion on plants, expand a little bit on what was talked about in the first video, and make sure that we kind of put it all together and put that cladogram at the end and talk about the progression of plants. This video is going to talk more about the advanced plants and some of the specific traits and characteristics that make them so advanced in allowing them to be as successful as they are in so many different ecosystems out there on Earth. So in the first video we talked a lot about the more basic categories of the kingdom Plantae, particularly the earliest plants, which are the bryophytes. Remember, the bryophytes are the non-vascular plants. They don't have vascular tissue. That means they can't transport water up the xylem, so the plants have to be very small and have to be close to water. Since they don't have vascular tissue, technically they don't have roots, stems, or leaves, because by definition all three of those have to have vascular tissue. So they're very primitive, very simple, basic plants that do what they need to do to make their own sugars and go through photosynthesis, but they can't really function in many different environments. As you get into the next major evolutionary advancement, which is vascular tissue, we now open up the possibilities of the size the plants can reach and the environments that they can survive in. So we call these primitive vascular, just to make it easy for you. So even though they have vascular tissue, so even though they're more advanced than the bryophytes, they still don't quite have some of the characteristics that give the really advanced plants the ability to survive in much more drastic environments. So we call these primitive vascular plants primitive because even though they have vascular tissue, they still don't yet have seeds. That's the big thing. That's going to be the next big advancement. So vascular tissue is one major advancement, one major characteristic that came after the bryophytes, so that the rest of the plant kingdom has vascular tissue. The next one's going to be seeds. These categories of plants, even though they're vascular, so they can be much larger and live in environments that aren't so focused on water, they still are tied very strongly to water because instead of seeds, they have something called sori, like you see there, or spores, or if you ever hear the word sporangia, all of those refer to these little tiny seed-like structures on the back side of their leaves that actually is how they reproduce. These little sori or spores will fall onto the ground, and if the ground's dry, then that's it. That plant can't have any opportunity of actually reproducing. But because they're primitive, they have to survive in an area that is still pretty wet, so that when those sori fall, they have the ability of actually being transported a little bit through the water and can get where they need to go, so they could possibly develop into a new one. The best example of these primitive vascular plants are called fern. I'm sure you guys have heard of fern before, or ferns, plural, depending on how you what you call them. But these are what we consider primitive vascular plants. So if you ever hear the word fern, think about these plants. They have long leaves that extend out like this and branch out as they go up. And on the back side of these fern, the healthy ones, they actually see all these little brown dots. So a lot of people look at a plant and see all these brown dots and think it's sick or dying or has some sort of a plant virus or something. But in reality, that's a healthy fern, because that fern has all the sori necessary and all the spores necessary that they can fall and actually reproduce successfully. So even though they're vascular, they're considered primitive vascular because they don't yet have seeds. Instead, they have spores or sori. So we're moving into the more progressive and the more advanced plants. From this point on, after the fern, we're going to get into the categories of plants that have seeds and now have multiple ways of being able to survive in environments and reproduce in those environments. So just remember, for this one, it's pretty straightforward. Primitive vascular plants have vascular tissue. They have a xylem to transport water up to the leaf. They have a phloem to transport the sugars out, so they can be significantly larger, but they're still tied to water specifically for reproduction. And because they don't have seeds, instead they have these sporangia or spores or sori to actually pass on the ability to produce offspring. Alright, so now let's move on. The next category of plants is what we consider the Gymnosperms. They're what we call the first seed plants. Remember this, the first seed plants in evolutionary history, the first plants to have seeds, are considered Gymnosperms. Gymnosperms pretty much categorize all types of pine trees out there. Anything that has pine needles long pokey needles instead of the typical leaves you're used to seeing are typically considered gymnosperms. So gymnosperms, the term gymnosperm means naked seed. So we say naked because the seed itself is exposed. All right, so in gymnosperms, they have seeds now, which means not only do they have vascular tissue, which says that they can be significantly taller to transport the water up a leaf, and they don't need as much water to be able to survive, but now they have seeds, which means they can reproduce without being tied to water for that process. Gymnosperms in particular take advantage of another type of pollination. So pollination is the term we're going to get into now with all of these seeded plants in terms of how they're able to actually get one seed out to an area where they can reproduce or redevelop into a new plant. In terms of a gymnosperm, they take advantage of wind for pollination. So their seeds typically have something to give them some sort of an aerodynamic lift. Right, so a lot of times you hear us refer to the gymnosperm seeds as having wings, just like an airplane. These wings give the seeds the ability so that if they do fall from wherever the seeds were attached, instead of falling straight to the ground, they just they're able to lift a little bit, and that little bit of a lift can give them a huge advantage in getting where they need to go. A good example of the categories of the actual male and female reproductive organs of a seed and a gymnosperm are what you see in front of you. The one on the left is what we call the pollen cone. The pollen cone is actually the male reproductive seed, and the female cone is what we consider the seed cone. That's what you see on the right. The one on the right is probably something that you're more familiar with if you're not huge into plants, because those are what mostly are considered pine cones. Pine cones are the ones that you guys see all the time. You see them on the floors and forests. You see them as decorations in Thanksgiving and you know, getting into the fall and winter. You see those decorations all the time. These pine cones are actually the female seed cones. So here's how it works. The pollen cone is what actually has the male seed. So the male seeds are actually pollen grains. So the pollen cones have these tiny, tiny little pollen seeds or pollen grains on them. As wind passes through the pollen grains, some of these little pollen grains fall off of the pollen cone. And because they have a little bit of a lift, they don't fall straight to the ground. Instead, they get a little bit of help and kind of floating temporarily in that air as it's falling. And if the plant is set up properly to give it the best chance of reproducing, usually the pollen cone will be up towards the top, and a seed cone will be sitting underneath it. And the seed cones, the ones that are actually fresh, that are still in a tree, have a sap, a sticky sap that's on the surface of all those little waxy outer cuticles, those waxy outer layers. There's a sticky sap that's there. What do you think that sticky sap is there for? Why do you think it's very important in this reproductive process? Exactly, it's for wind pollination. So as the male pollen cone falls and pulls off some of the grains off of the cone, they're going to fall, and if it catches and is able to stick onto a female seed cone, then you now have the male sex cell or the male gamete matched up on the female organ, which will then have the female gametes inside of them as well. So then within that female seed cone, if it catches a male pollen cone, that seed cone will fall to the ground. It now has the male and the female components, which can turn around and produce a fully new plant. So this is how pine and other types of trees, junipers and things like that, are able to reproduce. They let the pollen grains from one fall into the seed female cone of another. Then that cone is now fertilized. It has both the male and female reproductive sex cells or gametes. So it falls to the ground, and if the environment is ideal and everything's set up properly, then a new plant can actually develop right next to it. So this is what we consider wind pollination, where the male pollen cone blows off some of the male pollen grains, and those grains are able to get caught in a female seed cone. And now you have the two in the same place that can fall and fertilize and produce a new plant. So that's called a gymnosperm. Again, this categorizes all of the pine trees, anything with pine long sticky needles instead of leaves. All right? So those are what we call gymnosperms, and they all typically use wind for pollination. You also have different categories of types of trees that do this, and the different types of seeds that have different aerodynamic characteristics for lift, and you know, different categories of types of plants and trees from there. But again, anything that uses pollen cones and seed cones and has something, a seed that's not surrounded by something, is what, the seed is what we consider a naked seed. It's exposed. That's what we call a gymnosperm. Alright, so gymnosperms are pretty advanced. They make up a pretty large category of plants on Earth today. They have vascular tissue, so they can become very, very large. And they also now have seeds, which means they don't have to be in an environment that's just fully soaked in water 24 hours a day. As long as they're getting enough water just to go through photosynthesis, they're good. So these are pretty advanced. Those are the two major components that now these gymnosperms have. And then there's one final category of plants, and these are what we consider the most advanced plants on Earth. Not only do they have vascular tissue, not only do they have seeds, but the seeds are actually surrounded by something to give it a better chance of actually getting pollinated. What they're surrounded by is usually what's going to entice the pollinators to come to them. Alright, so in this case, the more advanced plants don't depend on random wind to be able to knock one off and just hope that the seed is able to fall where it's supposed to go. These actually can completely entice other organisms to come over and actually help them pollinate themselves. And those are what we consider angiosperms. So angiosperms are categorized as all of the different plants on Earth that have one of two combinations. They have flowers, they make fruits, or they have both. So any plant that can produce a flower or a fruit is considered an angiosperm. So there's a large category of these types of plants on Earth, and depending on the different types of environments, you get all different categories of flowers and fruits blooming from them, which gives us a lot of the variety in our diet as well. So let's start by talking about angiosperms as a whole. So the whole plant actually makes more of itself, taking advantage of seeds that are no longer naked, they're no longer exposed like the gymnosperms, but instead they're surrounded by a fleshy, usually sweet outer coating called an ovary. The ovary is the fleshy, sweet outer coating surrounding a seed. You and I probably know it better as a fruit, right? So think of any fruit. When you're eating a fruit, you're eating that outer layer that's there to entice the pollinators to come and actually feed off of them. So we call this type of pollination, rather than wind pollination with gymnosperms, we call this animal pollination, because they actually depend on animals to come over and feed off of them. That's why these plants have over time developed high concentrations of sweet sugar on the outside ovary of their seed, because the sweeter the fruit, the more likely it is to get pulled and fed on by an animal. And as an animal is able to pull off fruit from a tree, breaks it down and feeds it and swallows the seeds, you'd think that's probably not too good for a plant. Why would I purposely want an animal to come and eat off of me? But in reality, what they're doing is setting up a perfect environment for that seed to actually be able to grow somewhere else. Because not only is that animal plucking it off and taking it away somewhere where maybe it's not going to have to compete as much for some of its resources, but over the course of its own digestion, and especially on its way out, it's going to supply the most natural form of fertilizer out there. So when that animal gets rid of the seed, it's getting rid of other things too that actually contain massive amounts of nitrates and excess carbon and things that can really help that seed develop into a new plant somewhere else. So the seed itself is what actually is going to make more of the whole plant. So the seed is probably the most important for the whole plant's reproduction. But within the plants, especially the ones that produce flowers, the flowers themselves do a great job of helping pollinate themselves. They don't make more plants, but the flowers can rebloom and make more flowers, and taking advantage of another type of animal pollination. This time, instead of the large animals feeding off of the big fruits, they take advantage of the really small animals out there, the ones that tend to fly around, especially with insects. So insect pollination, because insects are also considered animals, is another type of animal pollination, but this is actually how flowers are able to reproduce, and we're going to walk through the specifics on that. So again, angiosperms have fruits and or flowers. The fruits are probably the most important component because the seed is actually what's going to produce more plants. The flowers are just able to reproduce within themselves and make more and more of themselves, taking advantage of the same thing that the fruits take advantage of, which is the animal kingdom feeding off of them. Alright, so let's break one down over the other. We already talked about the large one with the fruits, how animals feed off of them, take the seed with them somewhere else, drop it with their own droppings, a natural fertilizer that could very conceivably produce a new plant from it. In the flower's case, the process of insect pollination takes place with the very specific components of that flower. And you guys are going to be doing a flower dissection here before too long, where you'll get the opportunity to really see the differences between the male and female components of that flower. The reproductive organs of the flower are very straightforward. There's the male section, is what we consider the stamen. The stamen is made up of two key parts. It has the anther, which is what you see at the very top, that has the actual pollen grains, and then it has the filament, which is what holds up the anther. So the male reproductive organ has the pollen. Again, just like the gymnosperm, if you remember, the pollen cone has the male pollen seeds that are there to be able to pass on to the female. So the same situations here. The male reproductive components of the flower, the stamen, has the anther, which is what actually produces the pollen grains. And this is the specific pollen that most people who have an allergy to plants have specifically for this pollen. So these pollen grains are very light, they're very easy to get up into the air, and can very easily be inhaled as well. That's why they're typically a big allergen for people. But the anther itself has the pollen grain. The filament just holds up the anther as high as possible. Now that's very important because the insects that come and feed off of the pollen have to also be close enough to the other parts of the female flower that are going to be just as high. So if the anther was super low, then it would be less successful in actually being able to fertilize with the rest of the flower. So the filament plays just as an important role of holding up the anther as high as it possibly can. So the male reproductive components of the flower is the stamen, which is the anther and the filament. The female reproductive organ is right in the middle, and it's what's considered, it has one of two names. It's either called the pistil, P-I-S-T-I-L, not like the gun, or a carpel, C-A-R-P-E-L. They both mean the same thing. You hear different names depending on which biology textbook you're looking at, so be familiar with both of them. But the female reproductive organ, the pistil or the carpel, actually has three components, three parts. It has a sticky part at the top called the stigma. It has a tube kind of holding it up, again, just like the filament. This one's called the style. And then underneath, at the very base of the style, is where the actual female seed is held, which is what's considered the ovary. Just like the ovary for humans is where the female eggs are held, the female seeds for the flower are held in the ovary of the carpel or the pistil. So it's the stigma at the top, the style that holds the stigma up, and then the ovary that's at the base. So here's the basic breakdown of what happens. The male anther has the pollen grain. If the pollen grain from the male anther can make it into the ovary of the female pistil, then we can have a new fertilization occur and a new flower can bloom in the place of the old one that might be dying out. The way it's able to get in there isn't because of wind, isn't through wind, it isn't through just natural ability of the two touching. They completely depend on insects that come in and feed off of it. So another major advancement of flowers that actually also helps attract insects to come in, besides just the sweetness of the nectar on the top of the stigma and the pollen grains themselves, is the actual flower's petals. Now petals, you guys know flowers have become very, very pretty. There are a lot of really pretty flowers out there. They're not made pretty so that they can be the ones that are sold for the most at florists and to be the ones that get put into bouquets the most often. Flowers look the way they do purely to attract insects to come and feed off of them. There are a lot of insects out there that have way better vision than we have, so they can view color and identify it from very far away. So the more attractive these petals are, the more likely an insect is that's flying over to actually get attracted to it and come towards it. So the petals play a very important role in attracting pollinators, but also we have the pollen grains themselves and that sweet sap that's at the top of the stigma that plays sort of a dual role. Besides attracting insects, it also plays the same role. The seed cone's sugary sap played of actually having a sticky surface to be able to catch the male sex cell or the male gamete. So in this case, the anther has the male pollen, and inside of the pistil or the carpel at the very base is the female seed. So you have insects that come in and feed off of off of the flowers, like different types of birds and possibly bees. You guys have heard probably before how when you were in elementary school your parents had to have the conversation of the birds and the bees with you. The reality is birds and bees don't really do much for each other, but they're both extremely important in the reproduction for a flower. So more realistically or more accurately, you probably need to have the birds in the flower talk, or the bees in the flower talk, but that's a separate issue. Anyway, so what you have here is these insects coming in and feeding off of the pollen grains that are on the anther. As they come in and feed off of the pollen grains, the pollen will actually stick to the body of that insect. So usually we have an insect like a bee coming in and feeding off of multiple flowers. So as it feeds off of one and pollen grains stick to it, it'll leave with the pollen grains and I can go to a different flower and start feeding off of that one as well. As it's landing on the surface of that flower to feed off of the new pollen grains, the stigma and the sticky sap on the top of the stigma, which is the top of the female organ, will actually catch and pull some of that pollen that was on that bee off of the bee, and now we have the pollen right at the top of the female organ. Once it's right at the top, it slowly passes its way down the style until it reaches that ovary right there at the base. And now you have the male pollen grain matched up with the female ovule is the name of the actual female egg, so the two can combine. That flower over time will kind of break apart and a new flower can bloom in its place. So it plays a very important role in being able to allow a flower to reproduce, because you have the male and the female reproductive organs, but they don't actually work on their own to match up. They need an insect to sort of be the vector or the middleman to grab the pollen from the anther and get it to stick onto the stigma of the female part of the flower. So that's how angiosperms reproduce, both in the seed form for fruits, being able to get the seed to be passed on, and for the pollen to be passed and pollinate for the flower. Alright, so there's one last thing I want to talk about here in relation to the fruit discussion for the angiosperm. I'm going to completely blow your minds here. This is going to be one of those moments where everything you used to think about the world is going to change, and you're never going to see the world the same again, right? This is going to be sort of like the day you found out Santa Claus wasn't real. Like this is a big deal. It's going to change a lot about what you think you know about plants. Unless, of course, you think Santa Claus is real, which of course he is, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But yeah, fruits. You probably have the wrong impression of a definition of a fruit. You may think of a fruit as something that tastes sweet, right? Something that is usually considered as a dessert or something that goes with a dessert, as compared to a vegetable, which you think of as not necessarily being sweet or having to do more with like the main course of a meal or in a salad or something like that, or as a side dish. That's probably how you categorize fruits and vegetables. The reality is, let's break it down. A fruit is the ovary, or what the fleshy tissue that surrounds a seed, right? Whereas a vegetable is every other part of that plant, which actually includes the seed itself, right? All of those things are actually vegetables. So that's the true definition and the distinction between a fruit and a vegetable. So based on that, let's see how you guys do on my little fruit vegetable quiz. I'm just going to start naming parts of a plant that you eat. You tell me if it's a fruit or a vegetable. All right, we'll start with some easy ones. How about a carrot? Carrot's a vegetable, right? It's a root in particular. Can you tell me the type of root? Taproot. Good. So a vegetable, carrot's a vegetable. An apple, it's a fruit, right? You have the fleshy tissue surrounding the seeds in the middle. That's what you're eating, right? So that's a fruit. An orange, also a fruit, right? You have the seeds in the middle. Limes, lemons, same thing, right? Fruits. Let's say celery. That's a vegetable, right? Yeah, you're eating the stem particularly. Same thing with asparagus and so on. Onions. Onions are vegetables. Technically, it's not a root. It's called a bulb. A bulb is what's at the base of a stem for some certain plants, and it actually has roots below it. So you've seen, it has, if you ever see an onion, like a yellow onion or anything, it actually has fibrous roots that come off from the bottom. So it's not a root in itself. It's called a bulb, but it is a vegetable still because it's not the fruit surrounding a seed. How about some ones that might confuse you here? Tomato. Yeah, tomato is kind of the standard one. Most people know that there's an argument out there of whether you consider a tomato to be a fruit or a vegetable. But by definition, what you're eating is that red fleshy tissue surrounding the soft seeds in the middle. So technically a tomato is a fruit if we use that definition, the actual definition, the scientific one. What about a cucumber? When you open up a cucumber, are there seeds in the middle? And you're eating the tissue surrounding that seed. So what do you think a cucumber is? It's a fruit. Yeah, zucchini, squash, same thing, same argument. It's a fruit. Any kind of a pepper, green pepper, red pepper, jalapenos, habaneros, all of those, fruits. Because you're eating what's surrounding the seeds that are in the middle, right? So completely changes probably what you used to think as the definition of a fruit to a vegetable, but the fruits are technically anything that surrounds the seeds of an actual plant. If you're eating peas, that's a vegetable because it's an actual seed. If you're eating pea pods, which are what surrounds the peas, like snap peas and things like that, you're eating fruits because you're eating what's surrounding the seed. So green beans are another good example of a fruit because it's surrounding the beans that are typically right in the middle. So hopefully that completely changed your world, and you're welcome for seeing the world in an entirely new light. I'm glad I could contribute to that. But I definitely want you to make sure you know the difference between a fruit and a vegetable, the scientific difference. That'll come in handy a little bit later. So keep that in mind. Alright, so angiosperms are the most advanced categories of plants. They have either the ability to produce fruits and or flowers. Alright, we've talked about the pollination process of how animals and insects can feed off of both the flower to give more flowers in the area, or larger animals can eat the fruits, taking the seeds with them and producing a natural fertilizer in a perfect environment to actually produce more of those fruits, more of those plants again later. Alright, the fertilization process with the flower we've talked about. This is the diagram of the female reproductive organ, which is the pistil or the carpel. It shows you right there at the top how the pollen grains can be stuck and attached to the stigma. As it is attached, the pollen grains pass through the surface of the stigma, down the style, all the way down into the ovary, which is right there at the base. And that's where the ovules are, which are the female seeds. So once the pollen grain, which is the male, matches up with the female ovule, now the fertilization process can actually happen, and a new flower can bloom right there at that base, which will sort of knock out the old flower, and you get this beautiful new flower blooming in its place. Alright, the next major thing is to be able to distinguish between the types of hormones. There are a few different categories of hormones, and this is one of the things that this Which Way lab, the lab that you guys are doing, growing plants, will allow you to focus in on. The categories of plant hormones are very important. There are 4 basic categories of plant hormones that you need to know about and know what they do. The first one that's discussed here, what we call ethylene. Ethylene is a hormone that will help ripen fruit. So when fruits naturally are growing off of a tree, ethylene slowly starts getting produced as the fruit becomes more and more mature. And as it slowly is produced, it starts producing more and more sugars in the actual fruit itself. So if you let a plant, or if you let a fruit grow in the actual tree and slowly add that ethylene naturally, it just adds more and more sweetness and more flavor to that fruit, so that by the time it's fully ripe, it tastes amazing. There's a huge difference between a fruit that's freshly plucked from a tree that was given the opportunity to really ripen on that tree or on the vine. It really gives it special flavor, really stronger flavor, because of the ethylene that's naturally produced there. Unfortunately, living in the society of profit here in America as we do, a lot of farmers will pluck fruit way before it's naturally ripened like this. The major reasons for that is because when it's fully ripened, it's also kind of soft and it doesn't ship well. there's a good chance that a really ripened fruit is going to get mashed together pretty severely by the time it makes it to wherever it's supposed to be sold at a market. So instead, they pull it out before it ripens, which means it's still pretty hard. It hasn't softened. It hasn't really gotten that flavor yet. So because all the fruit are still pretty hard, they can manage to travel pretty easily without much damage. So farmers prefer that because obviously that means there's more that can get sold. So they'll take them way before they ripen, pluck them off, and they'll stay hard for however long they need. And then right before they get to the market, usually like within a day before they get put out so that people can start buying them, they shock it with ethylene, which means they'll start spraying this hormone, a lot of times in the truck that carries the fruit from one place to the other, from the farm to the supermarket. They'll actually spray out ethylene into the truck or spray it directly on the fruit, and that'll shock the fruit into quickly starting to ripen. And because it quickly ripens, it doesn't produce as much sugar as the other way, which means what you're left with at the store doesn't taste as sweet, isn't really as good as something that you would had you had the same kind of a tree in your backyard and allowed it to really ripen naturally before you pulled it out. So ethylene plays a very important role in ripening fruits, and once that ripening process happens, you can't reverse it. So that's really why a lot of fruits and stuff, you have to buy them early, you have to buy them in decent condition at the supermarket, and you have to eat them pretty quickly after you buy them, or else they slowly start to rot, because that ethylene, once it's produced, continues producing the sugars and continues to break down everything around it until you just are left with mush. So bananas, things like that are good examples of fruits that once they ripen have a very small shelf life where you really need to take advantage of them before they over ripen and become soft and go the other way. So ethylene is very important there. Another hormone that's very important in the farming industry are called gibberellins. Gibberellins are growth hormones. It's a hormone that can actually cause some pretty substantial growth in fruit. So if you ever see those Guinness Book of World Record people trying to make as big a fruit as possible, world's largest pumpkins and things like that, they're just ramming gibberellins into that plant as it grows to try to give it as much growth as possible. Gibberellins are actually categories of fungus that are put on these fruits to give them more possibilities of growth, because the fungus is a decomposer, helps provide nutrients like nitrates and carbon to the fruit so that it can really grow. So gibberellins allow for really significant growth of fruit, don't forget that. Auxins are the next category. They play a very important role in the next thing we're going to talk about, which are tropisms, which is how plants can actually change and move. Auxins allow for cell elongation. So the stem is the major part of a typical plant. It's where most of the growth happens. The stem cells, the cells that are in the stem of the plant, are typical sizes, and auxins are what control how those cells grow. So auxins can actually adjust if one side is growing faster than another, and theoretically if you have the left side and the right side of a stem growing at the same rate, then the stem grows upright, straight up, right? But now let's say the left side is growing a little faster than the right side. So if the left side is growing a little faster than the right side, these cells are getting longer and these cells are shorter. That actually causes the whole thing to tweak and twist and turn into a direction. And that's where we're going to get into all these different kinds of movements of flowers. So that deals with auxins. So auxins play a very important role in cell elongation of the stem, and particularly play important roles in being able to twist or turn a flower or a plant. Finally, cytokinins are categories of hormones that allow for bud growth, so like the original extension of buds from a seed, and they also allow for more lateral growth, or growth from left to right. So auxins allow for vertical growth, cytokinins allow for lateral growth. So if you ever want a plant to get real tall, you introduce auxins. If you want a plant to get wide, extend out, you introduce cytokinins. Okay, so just remember those four basic categories of hormones. Ethylenes ripen, gibberellins allow for substantial growth of fruits, auxins allow for cell elongation and vertical growth and can actually adjust how vertical growth moves in certain directions, and cytokinins allows for the initial growth of the buds or the seeds and for lateral growth of the more mature plants. And then finally we have our category of tropisms. A tropism just means turning, or basically a reaction. There are three categories of tropisms. There's thigmotropism. You guys saw this in the video at the very beginning of this lecture, the Oprah Winfrey Life video. You actually watch plants grabbing on to other larger plants to allow them to get where they're supposed to go. That's called thigmotropism. Thigmo means touch. So it's when plants are actually touching other plants to help them move. Anything with a vine. The vine is a good example of a thigmotropism occurring, grabbing onto things so they know where they are to be able to move themselves forward or up to get to where there's more light or a better environment. That's thigmotropism, which is to touch. The next one is what we call phototropism. That's turning towards light. So again, auxins play an important role here. If you have cells that are even on both sides, then the plant goes straight up. But if there's a strong energy source, strong solar source coming from one direction, the plant wants to move into that direction so it gets the most light intensity. So it'll actually make the cells on the left side grow faster than the ones on the right, so that little by little these cells are taller, the other ones are shorter, which is going to cause it to turn into that direction. So that's called phototropism, and auxins play a very important role in that. The third one that auxins play an important role in as well is called gravitropism. This is basically a reaction due to gravity. Here's the idea. The roots always grow with gravity, or downward, and then the stem should usually grow against gravity or upward. That's why most plants usually are upright like that. The roots are growing at the bottom to give it a base, and as the roots are growing down, the stem grows up. That's gravitropism. Now you can see this in a little more unique environments if you see something like the picture here where a plant's actually growing off to a side. If you have a plant growing off to a side for a number of different reasons, the plant won't just always grow off into that horizontal direction. It may grow off just temporarily, but typically you see that plant make its way upright. Even if it starts sideways, it'll manage to get upright because of this natural reaction of stems to grow upward against the force of gravity. And again, auxins play an important role. These ones here on the bottom are going to grow faster than the ones on the top to slowly allow for that bend to get it back upward and into that upward direction. So that's called gravitropism. Tropism due to gravity, which means it's moving upward. Regardless of the initial direction of the growth, plants will usually always manage to get themselves back upward by the time the leaf needs to get to what it needs for photosynthesis. Because usually up is where you go to get the most light, the most substantial amounts of energy, and most successful environment. So plants just naturally have developed that need to work against gravity in that final growth, gravitropism. So remember the three tropisms, guarantee you're going to see that on the test. Alright, the final categories here is dealing with seed dispersal. So we've talked about seeds here, the different types of pollination. Let's go through some of the examples. This is an apple or a fruit. We have said before they use animal pollination to occur here. The animal feeds off of the fleshy ovary surrounding the seed and then provide a perfect fertilizer environment when they drop their seeds as they pass through the digestive system to possibly produce a whole new plant in that place. Coconuts are actually a good example of tropical fruits. There are some that have actually worked sort of backwards. We said before that seeds, the benefit of them is they now are no longer tied to water for reproductive purposes, but these ones, because of their environments where they grow in such tropical environments that when they fall, they actually use the currents of the water that's right off the coast of where they're able to grow to transport that plant from one place to the next, or transport that seed from one place to the next. So coconuts, pineapples, mangoes, all of those things can actually take advantage of water pollination because as they fall, they're usually close to a shoreline and the currents of that beach will actually move it for them. So we consider that water pollination, which is kind of an odd term, sort of an oxymoron, because the whole fact that they have seeds means you're supposed to be able to get away from water. But the ones that are tropical just take advantage of their environment. You have wind pollination, which categorizes all of our gymnosperms. A dandelion is a good example of another thing that uses wind pollination. All of those extensions of dandelions are actually seeds. They can make it off and possibly land in an area where it'd have a better chance of surviving, maybe a little less competitive because there aren't as many of the same plant around it, so they get more of its resources. So that's wind pollination. And then there's also the fourth category that we call an explosive pollination. The picture here doesn't really do it justice, but explosive pollination comes from seed dispersal with anything in a pod. So peas are a good example. A pea, as it grows, will actually break the pod open. It comes to a point where there's so much pressure that the pea pod will burst open, and in that process seeds will fall out. So the release of those seeds and landing on in other areas around it is another example of seed dispersal. We call that explosive pollination. So we have wind pollination in water, animal, and explosive. So just be familiar with the 4 categories of seed dispersal. And there's a station that you'll do in relation to that as well. Alright, so that basically covers everything you need to know in terms of plants. To sort of bring it all back together, this is that same cladogram that we started with at the beginning of the first lecture, where it shows you the most primitive plants, which are the moss, the non-vascular plants. They are primitive because they don't have vascular tissue, so they're very small. They have to live in environments very close to water. Now, the first vascular plants are what we still consider primitive vascular, because even though they have vascular tissue, they're not yet to the point where they've developed seeds. So they can grow pretty tall, but they still depend on water. They have to be pretty close to water at all times in order to pass those sporangia, or the sori, or the spores, to produce their own offspring. Now, with the production of seeds and the presence of seeds, we now move into the first seed plants, which are the Gymnosperms. They have the naked seeds, which means there is no fruit or ovary surrounding the seed. The male pollen grains break off with wind and have a little bit of a lift because they have wings on their seeds, and little by little they're able to hopefully land on the female seed cone that catches it because of the sticky sap and can produce its own offspring that way through wind pollination. And then finally, the most advanced plants have the flowers and or fruits and are considered our angiosperms, which can now benefit from animal or insect pollination and don't have to depend on waiting for a nice windy day to hope that a seed will fall exactly the way it's supposed to fall. So this gives you all of the variations of all of the plant kingdom. Hopefully you're comfortable with all the different details that we covered here, and you should be ready to go for the test. So study up, take care of your plant stations, and I will see you in the next unit.